Welcome to the 1960s Project. The 1960s Project brings you voices from the 1960s. In the 1960s Project, we've been recalling, remembering, and reflecting on events that have influenced our lives. This is Season 2, Week 17. We begin this month by exploring the life of Malcolm X. He was born on May 19th, 1925, and communities across the country annually pause to remember the life of Malcolm X. The voices of the 1960s will be sharing their perspective on aspects of the life of El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz throughout the month of May. My name is Louis Hicks, and I'll be hosting today's live conversation. But first, just a little bit about me and who I am. I am a 1969 graduate of L.C. Anderson High School in Austin, Texas, and my voice represents a graduate in 1969 from high school. Most recently, from May 2015 through September 2019, I served as Humanities DC's Director of Grants prior to my retirement from the agency. Prior to that, I spent more than 30 years working in museums in various capacities as a museum director, an exhibit designer, a publicist, and a fundraiser. Currently, I'm a member of the Association for the Study of African-American Life and History as part of their leadership team to plan an annual Black History Festival in the month of February. But before I introduce our guests, I have 4 asks for you. Like us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, read and comment on our blogs, and share our show, videos, and blogs. Let me welcome A. Peter Bailey and give you a little bit of a background to who he is. Hello, Peter.
Hello, Louis. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'd like to tell our viewers a little bit about who you are before we go into our questions. First of all, Peter is an acclaimed journalist, author, and lecturer. He will share his personal experiences with Malcolm X. Peter is recognized as an authority on Malcolm X, and he was born in Columbus, Georgia, raised in Tuskegee, Alabama, and attended Tuskegee Institute High School. He graduated from Nuremberg American High School in Germany in 1955. From 1956 through 1959, Peter served in the U.S. Army, and from there went on to attend Howard University until 1961. A year later, in 1962, Peter relocated to Harlem, New York City, and in 1964 became a founding member of Malcolm X's Organization of Afro-American Unity, OAAU. Peter has served as the editor of the OAAU's newsletter, Black Flash. He has served as Associate Director of Black Theater Alliance, BTA, and contributed articles to numerous national publications, including Jet, the New York Times, Negro Digest, Black World, and many other publications. He's currently working on his second and forthcoming book on Malcolm, Brother Malcolm X's Visionary, Strategic Pan-Africanism, Why It Enrages the United States Government. And at the end of our show, Peter will tell you exactly how you can order copies from him. We'll post his information at the end of the show. Okay, welcome again, Peter, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Louis.
Sure, you're welcome. My first question I have to ask you, how did the circumstances come together for you to graduate from high school in Germany?
Okay, I was going to go to that. My father was in the military, and in the middle of my sophomore year in high school, he was stationed in Nuremberg, Germany, and so the whole family went. I really did not want to go. I wanted to stay, and graduate with all my friends that I'd gone to school with, for most of my life. But Dad insisted that it would be a very good experience for me to go, and so I went with my family and went my last 2.5 years of high school. I attended Nuremberg American High School in Nuremberg, Germany. They had high schools like that all over Germany, about 7 of them, for children of U.S. military personnel. And that's how I ended up graduating from Nuremberg American High School.
Okay.
And immediately, shortly after graduation, my father was transferred back to the United States, and so I came back, and I graduated in June 1959. 55, I'm sorry, man, I got to remember this stuff. June 1955, and we came back to the States in late August 1955.
Okay. My next question, I also noticed that after your military service, you attended Howard University. And from there, within a year, you left Howard in 1962 and moved to New York. So was it your intention to eventually return back to Howard to finish your degree?
Yes, I went to Howard. I had definite plans after I had summer jobs working as a counselor with the Fresh Air Fund. Used to bring young people from inner city communities in New York and bring them up, and they would come up for 2 weeks. I think it was up in Westchester County or right above Westchester County. And I was a counselor there for 2 summers. And what I would do is at the end of the summer, then I would come back to DC. But after my second summer, I had kind of met people, most of the other people were from New York who were counselors in the camp. And I had met some very interesting people, and they were telling me about Harlem and this and all this kind of stuff. So I decided I was going to stay in New York during the fall, and then go back to Howard in the spring semester. And it ended up never going back.
Okay.
Never going back. And I said it worked out for me, because if I had gone back to Howard, I probably would not have met Brother Malcolm the way that I did.
That's a perfect segue, because I think I was reading in another account that one of your first encounters was not a face-to-face encounter with Malcolm, but you just happened upon a speech. So tell us about that.
Well, in 1962, the summer, I'm almost certain it was sometime in June, a friend of mine, I had decided that I didn't want to live in Harlem, because you heard all these horror stories about Harlem, and I believed them. So I was living on what they call the west side of Manhattan. I think it was in the West 80s. I had a small apartment there. And then one day, a friend of mine, his mother called me and said that the gentleman that she was, who was going with, had a nice apartment in Harlem on 142nd Street, 8 rooms for $56 a month.
Wow, that's amazing.
Where they had the rent control apartments, and it was like what they call a railroad apartment. Where you have a long hall, all the rooms on one side, and then you have this long hallway, and on the other side. So I said, man, for that kind of money, I'll take my chances. So I moved into Harlem on a Friday night with a roommate. And Saturday morning, instead of unpacking, we decided we're going to walk down from 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue down to 125th Street. By the way, Lenox Avenue is now Malcolm X Boulevard. So we walked down what was then Lenox Avenue. We got to 125th Street, which of course is the main street in Harlem. So we decided to keep walking. So we got down to 116th Street and then Lenox, and we saw a crowd gathering. So we said, "What's happening?" And they said Malcolm X is going to speak. And at that time, I had just kind of heard about him vaguely, and usually they were like, "Oh, he was a terrible person. He hated all white folks and all that kind of stuff." But I really had not heard enough to have any real opinion about him. And I noticed they were setting up on the sidewalk across the street from the mosque. That's where the Nation of Islam mosque was located. And right across the street, they had a very wide sidewalk, and they had set up a platform there from which he was going to speak. So I said to my roommate, I said, "Listen, let's see what he got to say. Let's see what he got to say." So we stood there, maybe been a couple thousand people there by the time, he began speaking. And he spoke for 3 hours.
Wow.
And by the time he finished, I was a Malcolmite, because I had never heard anyone in my life talk about race in this country with such clarity and knowledge and passion and believability. And there were two things he said that day that stuck with me immediately. One, he said something to the effect that people think racism is only in the South. White supremacy is only in the South. He said, no, white supremacy is a dominant thing throughout this country. The entire country has a white supremacist attitude towards Black people. He says maybe a little bit stronger in the South, but it's throughout this entire country. That's one thing he said that I remember from that day. But the most important thing he said that day that I remembered, and he talked about it for at least 45 minutes to an hour. I had never in my life, Louis, heard anyone talk about attacks on the mind.
Mm-hmm.
I had never heard anyone talk about that. And at college, nowhere had I heard anyone talk about attacks on the mind. And by the time he finished with that, man, I was like, I was just completely said, man, I became a Malcolmite. And though I was not, going to join the Nation of Islam, wherever he spoke in the New York City area, I was there. And I would listen to what he was saying. And if he mentioned a book, I would try to find the book and read it. If he mentioned an article, I would try to find the article and read it. And that's how I was introduced to him. And I followed him like that until maybe, let's say in by this time I had gotten a job working at Time Inc., which is part of what they call Rockefeller Center in New York, where you got all these big tall buildings, and they're connected together underground by with sidewalk, with coffee shops and restaurants and little stores and everything underground. Rockefeller Center, they call it. And I would eat down there because Time Inc. building was connected to that. NBC building was also connected to that. And one day while eating there, maybe sometime in the fall or early winter of 1963, I met a young woman, and we began to talk a lot about different political things and racial things that were going on. And she was an intern, one of the first interns the NBC had hired, Black interns, to work in the television industry. And then one day because at this time I'm still following Brother Malcolm. And of course I became aware of the whole problem that between him and the Nation of Islam. And we talked about that. And then one day in, I guess, December of 1963, she said to me, "Would you like to be a part of the establishment of a new organization?" And a new Black nationalist organization. And I said, yes. Kind of shocked me because somehow I never kind of figured her as a Black nationalist. Despite our conversation, you never gave me the impression that she was a Black nationalist type. So I said, yeah. She said, well, I'll call you on Saturday morning and tell you where to meet and what time to be there. So she called me and she told me about this motel around 153rd Street and Broadway in Manhattan. And I was kind of shocked because I had heard vaguely about that place. It had a reputation to be one of those places where you could check in for 2 hours.
Okay. Got
So
it.
I would say, why? I would say, how are we having a meeting in this place? You know what I mean? And but I didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. So I got there at the time I was told to be there, and I walked. We had a meet. There was a conference room on the ground level. I walked in, and when I got there, maybe about 8 or 9 people were there, and they'd include Dr. John Henry Clark and people like that. You know, who I had heard about. Some of them but had never met. And of course, my friend, she was there. Her roommate was there, and we talked. We sat around, had this long table there with chairs, and we sat there and talked. And after we'd been there about 15 or 20 minutes, now I'm still not knowing, what really was going on. About 15 or 20 minutes after I sat down and we were talking, in walks Brother Malcolm.
Wow.
With about 3 or 4, people, other members of the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, because he had set up Muslim Mosque Incorporated after leaving the Nation of Islam. And they walked in, and my brother almost fell off my chair. I had no idea until he walked through that door that I was going to be part of the founding of an organization with Brother Malcolm.
Wow.
And he came in and sat down and introduced himself. We introduced ourselves, and then he started telling us about this new organization he was forming, and it was going to be called the Organization of Afro-American Unity, and named after the Organization of African Unity, which had been founded in 1963, the year before, and was scheduled to have a meeting the first meeting was in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, in 1963, and the second meeting was scheduled in July 1964 in Cairo, and that's how I met Brother Mal.
Great. You kind of helped me jump ahead a little bit, but I want to take you back a little bit because some of our viewers have cursory knowledge about Brother Malcolm and understand him as being a very radical and very forward-thinking person. As a former military person, I imagine from that first speech that you heard that you were kind of moved toward the ideas. So can you help us with a timeline to understand how Brother Malcolm got to the place where he was ostracized from the Nation of Islam and then branched off to form his own organization?
Okay. Well, now, as I said before, I was not a member. I did not become a member of the Nation of Islam.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to make it very clear, and I have never claimed to be, and I was not a part of Brother Malcolm's inner circle.
Okay.
So as I said, once I discovered, found out about him, wherever he spoke in the New York area, I went and heard him speak several times without, never met him, just went and listened to him speak. And then I remember hearing, the thing rose about this whole thing of him being suspended in the Nation of Islam. The Kennedy assassination occurred, and then him being suspended because of, they claim he said something about the chickens coming home to roost.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember following that, and then I began to hear about him setting up Muslim Mosque Incorporated. I really still don't know if I was would have joined the Muslim Mosque Incorporated. I was at that time, Louis, kind of, I was 24 years old, and I was just kind of pulling myself away from the Christianity that I had been raised in, and I was not ready to go into another religion. So I was not going to join Muslim Mosque Incorporated, which is what he founded after. But I heard about it and I knew about it, and it kept wondering what was going on. And like I said, until this young lady said to me, and I found, she was from California and she had met Brother Malcolm earlier, and she had meetings with him. She and her roommate and a couple other people, and that's when they first started talking about forming this new organization, this secular organization for people such as her and myself, who wanted to work with Brother Malcolm, yet who were not, inclined to become members of the Muslim Mosque Incorporated. So that's how that all came about.
Great. You eventually became editor for his publication, Back Blacklash. So if you can help me understand your emotions and experience when you first met Brother Malcolm face to face.
Okay. First of all, I was impressed with his, as I said, when he spoke, especially when the first time I heard him, with his knowledge. But when I saw him speak in that small group, because there were maybe about 12 or 13 of us in that room with him, and I saw how he listened. And I always tell students, man, he listened so intensely that you could almost see it, that he was listening to what other people said. And I noticed that right away. And I tell young people that I learned from that experience that in order to be a great leader, you also have to be a great listener. You have to be someone who listens to what other people say and who and absorb if they're telling something that you can then keep. And so as we had these meetings for several months planning this new organization. And when it was time to talk about what you were going to do in the organization, people volunteered for the youth committee and the economics committee and the political committee and God, what was some of the other ones? I'm good. But there were different committees.
Mm-hmm.
But Brother Malcolm also made it very clear he wanted a newsletter, and nobody said anything about it. So I volunteered to help put out the newsletter. Now, at that time, I had no type of journalistic experience. My goal when I was going to Howard was to be major in political science and maybe to teach, on the high school level. So I had never even thought even remotely about being a journalist, despite the fact that I was working at Time Inc. at the time. And I was working with what they call an editorial reference clerk, where in the bio files, my job was to read it. In New York City, they had 7 newspapers. I had to read all 7 of those newspapers every single day and go through them. And there were articles in there that should go into these bio files that we would later send to the Time Inc. reporters. I had to circulate, clip it out, and then file it wherever it was supposed to go. In the bio files, I was dealing with names. And but at that, I still had never thought about being a journalist. And so when nobody volunteered to do the newsletter, I volunteered to do the newsletter. And that's how I became the editor of the newsletter. And the first 3 issues, we called it the OAAU newsletter. And the first article I ever wrote was about the riot, the 1964 riot in Harlem that came about when that policeman shot and killed that 15-year-old boy and claimed that the boy had a knife, which was never found. I wrote my first article that was in our first newsletter. I wrote an article about that. And I went out and interviewed the students, who had been with the young man and who, and that's how I got into journalism. And then by the 3rd issue, at that time, there was beginning to be a lot of talk in New York City about the white backlash to the movement that was going on. They were upset about things. So they said there's now a white backlash to the movement. And so the brother, who's an incredible brother named Leonard Sneed, Leonard handled the production end of the newsletter. I handled the editorial side. He handled the production side. So we were talking, and I said, we should what do we call our newsletter? The OAAU Blacklash. And that began with the 4th issue. And that was the title from the 4th through the 9th issue, which was the last issue, the number 9. And basically I have copies of all 9 issues. And we were doing the cover during that period of time. Is when Brother Malcolm was traveling internationally a lot, especially to Africa. And we were covering everything he was doing. So we had a lot of coverage of what he was doing internationally in our newsletter. And of course we covered other things too, but that's how that came about.
And that was my other question.
We officially, the OAAU was officially announced on June 28, 1964. That's when it was officially, that's considered although we had been meeting since January, the founding date for the OAAU was June 28, 1964.
I was curious to know how many pages and the broad range of topics that it covered. And you mentioned his travel, his international work, and what he
Yes.
was doing. Basically, anything else? What other topics were included?
Well, we covered, things that were happening in the black. I wrote the editorials. This is my first time writing it. I must say that though I had no experience in that, in journalistic writing, all throughout my career as a student, I was always very good in history and those kind of. In fact, I always I used to tell my own sons, I got straight A's in everything from first grade through high school. I got straight A's in everything except penmanship and conduct.
Interesting. I think that's one of the
I
things
still
that
can't
people are
write. I
lacking.
still write very badly. I have to print because my writing is still not too good. My penmanship, and of course, I think my conduct has improved. But I used to get C's in conduct, and it used to drive the teachers mad because I always say, if you're cutting up, you get bad grades. But I cut up and got A's.
All right.
And everything, but that's how I ended up, and that's how Brother Malcolm is directly responsible for my being a journalist today.
Sorry, Peter, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'm just kind of curious about the name of the newsletter. You settled on Backlash. Why that specifically?
Because there was beginning to be a talk in New York City about a white backlash. They were talking about, white people getting up, tired of black folks doing this and tired of this and tired of that. And they were going to start, like pushing back to the movement, to the civil rights movement. So we decided with the fourth issue, I suggested to the brother, he agreed with me. So we started calling our newsletter The Blacklash. That's how it got its name. We call it The Blacklash.
Okay.
And it was a direct result of a response to this, of the whites talking about the white backlash that was going on.
One of the other things I thought about as I was kind of composing my questions was to consider where Brother Malcolm was at the end of his life, and also if he were alive today, what would you think about? What would he think about what's happening today with the police killings and the violence that's occurred and the rise of the movement Black Lives Matter?
Well, I think that Brother Malcolm had. I'm going to read something that he wrote back in one of our newsletters, and about that will give some kind of idea that here's what he's saying, what Black people should do. Now, he wrote this in 1964. He said, we must establish all over the country schools of our own to train our children to become scientists and mathematicians. We must realize the need for adult education and for job training programs. This will emphasize a changing society in which automation plays the key role. We intend to use the tools of education to help raise our people to an unprecedented level of excellence and self-respect through their own efforts. That's something that he was directed. And Louis, let me read you one other quick one like that.
Great.
Now this was directed about young people. He says, I recommend that the adult African American community immediately get together and set up a guardian system so that any Black child in trouble or who has a problem can come to them for help. If any more African Americans children are shot down in the New York City streets, the adults will have to share the blame.
Mm.
Now, this brother wrote this in 1964.
Wow. Amazing how relevant it is today.
Do you hear me, brother?
Yeah, I sure do.
He wrote this in 1964, because, they had the Harlem uprising, and then they had the uprising, I think, over in Newark, things that happened, somewhat like what's going on today. But he was, in fact, but Brother Malcolm, as you can imagine, he was not into this kind of, running in the streets and screaming and chanting. And, he was not into that. In fact, when the Harlem thing occurred in 1964, he was in Africa. Although some New York City newspapers were swearing that he was in some secret hideaway in Brooklyn or Queens, directing what was happening in the streets during that time. But he was in Africa, and he would call back to the office to get some ideas of what was going on. And when it was my turn to speak with him, I said in the very first newsletter that I told you about, and this is where I show people his knowledge of the legal system. I said eyewitnesses to the murder, and he stopped me. He said, "No, Brother Peter, you can't use murder or murderer, because those are legal terms that can only be used once he's convicted. If you call him that and he's acquitted, and we know he's going to be acquitted, he can then sue." He said, "Call him a killer and refer to it as a killing, because he's a killer, and it's a killing no matter what the circumstances."
Yeah.
And that's where I learned from Brother Malcolm. And we had already run off about 600 copies of the newsletter with this article in it. So we went through it. Brother Leonard and I went through it and scratched out the word murder and wrote killing at the top, because we had those old-fashioned mimeograph machines, So we didn't want to run them all over again. Plus, we didn't have that kind of money throw away 600 pages of paper. So we wrote, and I still have copies there. We scratched out the word, but sure enough, when that cop was acquitted, he sued Martin Luther King's organization and CORE for putting out flyers calling him a murderer. That's when I saw that Brother Malcolm, had that kind of thing of the legal system. And I try to tell people, man, he believed in thought before you did things. He told us that if we're having a meeting or a rally and somebody stand up, we ought to bomb the subways. He said, stop the meeting and put that person out, because 9 times out of 10, that person is an informant. He said, nobody who's serious is going to get up and start talking about bombing subways. He said, and if we have him at our meeting and we discuss something or talk about that for even a minute, they can pick us all up and accuse us of, comes out of conspiracy, although they know they have a weak case, but they can keep us out of in the courts for a year to a year and a half. So we were conscious of that. We don't let nobody stand at our meetings talking about bombing this and bombing that, because Brother Malcolm was well aware of that, and how that sometimes they put people in there for that to cause that kind of discussion, so they can pick everybody up, which is what they did later to organizations. But that's when I say, he once taught us to think. You plan. You don't just run out, and jump up and down and chant and run through the streets and all that kind of thing. He did not. He told us in fact, brother, he told us to keep our people out of what was going on in Harlem in 1964.
Great.
Despite the fact that the press was saying that he was in some kind of hideaway, directing the whole stuff, he basically told us to keep out of it. Keep our young people, because I was 24, but there were people younger than me, and he said, keep our young people out of that. So we did. We called them together and said, Brother Malcolm said, we're not going to get involved in that. And it took us hard. It was hard. But we were able to keep most of our young people from getting involved. So they end up, arrested, and then got to go through the course and all that kind of stuff. So, and although the cops really were deliberately, to me, tried to provoke us. Because I remember when we had a balcony. We were on the second floor at the Hotel Teresa in Harlem, at 125th Street and 7th Avenue. And there was a balcony there. And a couple of us was on the balcony, and these cops were grabbing somebody and brutalizing them. So we said, look at what they're doing. Look at what they're doing. And the cop looked up and said, cursed at us and told them to get us out of there. We were in the OAAU office, told the cop to get us out of that office. Brother, you know what those cops did? They lined up down, because it was we were on the second floor, and they had steps you had to walk down. They lined up on each side of those steps, and we had to walk through them. And you could just see they were waiting for one of us to say something or make any kind of move so they could jump us and beat us. But everybody, we was about 7 or 8 of us in there, and we talked about it. And we said, now, it told everyone what to do. Don't do nothing. Remember what Brother Malcolm said. Just look straight ahead and walk down. And that's what we did. And we got out to the streets without them, providing them with a reason to jump us and beat us.
Peter, I want to pause just for a second. We have Joy Ford Austin tuning in, and then several other people. I see Lisa has joined us, and Okala, Jerome's sister. If any of you of our viewers have questions for Peter, our producer Ty will see your questions and then post them. Cynthia Page has a question for you, Peter. Had Malcolm become El Hajj Malik when he wrote this?
When he wrote what?
I'm not sure what Cynthia is referring to, but maybe I'm not sure.
Well, he became I don't know the exact date, but I know it was sometimes, I think, in the summer of 1964 when he became El Hajj Malik.
Okay.
That was sometime. I don't know the exact time I did that, but I do remember it was in the summer of 1964.
Okay. I think Cynthia was asking about the quote that you read earlier. So had he changed his name at that point?
Which quote?
You had read one of the first quotes.
Did I? No, I don't think so.
Okay.
At this time, those 2 quotes I read to you were basically quotes when he was still when we were still setting up the OAAU.
Okay.
They were a part of the discussion around the OAAU goals and objectives, and that was from January 1964 to June 1964.
And
now, because he spent much of the time during that year carrying out his international policy. He was a strong Pan-Africanist, and he believed very strongly that it was absolutely necessary to have a close relationship between Black people on the continent of North America and Black people on the continent of Africa. So he spent a lot of time, doing that whole year. That's why the OAU, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But during in the spring and summer of 1964, he spent a lot of time in Africa, man. And I think it was in May 1964, he went to Africa and he had audiences. Now remember, brother, not audiences, not you meet somebody at a reception, you shake hands, you talk for a couple minutes, and then you move on. He had audiences ranging from 1.5 hours to 3 hours with the following: President Ezekwe of Nigeria, President Nasser of Egypt, President Nkrumah of Ghana, President Nyerere of Tanzania, President Kenyatta of Kenya, President Toure of Guinea, and Prime Minister Obote of Uganda. He had audiences with them. And then after that, he was invited to the July 1964 OAU meeting in Cairo, where he issued them an 8-page document explaining in detail why he thought it was absolutely necessary to have a deeper relationship between Africans on the continent and people of African descent in North America.
And in 1964, had he made his first Hajj to Mecca, or was it a?
He did that in 1964.
Okay, great. Because that seems like that was a pivotal point in his career where his views began to change.
No, but wait a minute. Let me talk about his views changing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Brother Malcolm said when he came back, he found that whites who accepted Islam have been able to overcome white supremacy. He ain't made no kind of big, broad statements about, about white folks changing. He said whites who accepted Islam, because they always left that out when they reported it. And he also, I have a statement that he made where he addressed sincere whites, and he put sincere in quotation marks. He said sincere whites should get together with other sincere whites in their communities and organize and then deal with the white supremacists in their communities. They were not going to become members of the OAAU. So I want to make that very clear.
Good point. Good point. Now, I know you've interviewed a lot of family members, and I want to pose the question, are the children of Malcolm continuing his work and following what he had left off at the point that he died?
Well, he had 6 daughters, 2 of whom were born after his death. Sister Betty was pregnant with the twins, and they were born after he was assassinated. The daughters basically are in charge of overseeing his estate and his papers and things, most of which are now at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York, which is the main New York City Public Library that's in Harlem. That's where most of his papers are. The daughters are there's a Malcolm X Verishiba's Education and Cultural Center in New York, in what was the old Audubon Ballroom. It is now, and the daughters are responsible jointly for that being in operation. As you can imagine, like everything else in the last year of this pandemic, things had to close down. But I assume that things are going to be opening up again. And I know before they had this, I have a group here in DC. We call ourselves Positive Black Folks in Action, and we always on May 19, we would celebrate Brother Malcolm's birthday, and on February 21st we would commemorate the assassination. And we had in June 28, 1964 was the 50th anniversary of the founding of the OAAU. So we had a big meeting there to celebrate that founding. And then in May 19 of 1965 would have been Brother Malcolm's 90th birthday. So we had a big celebration at the center again to celebrate his birthday. So I'm hoping that once the pandemic thing clears up, that the center will reopen and once again be a place. It's called the Malcolm X Verishiba's Center for Education and Culture, and it's located in what was the old Audubon Ballroom.
Okay.
Columbia University, had owned that space, was trying to go tear it down, but we raised so much hell about it that they had to back down, and they gave a part of the building to set up the center. Oh,
great. Excellent. Which brings me to the other question that was on my mind in a colleague post. I know that people outside of the family didn't have very much contact with Betty Shabazz, but did you have any occasions to meet her or get to know her at all?
Okay. During the time with the OAAU before the assassination, but I had met Sister Betty on a couple of occasions when she was with Brother Malcolm, and that when she came to an OAAU rally or something like that, I met, but I did not really get to know her because at that time the Muslim wives were not really very active. Plus she had 4 little children.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so I got to know her after the assassination, but she told me one day, despite the fact, like I said, I did not know her that well, but she asked me to be a pallbearer at the funeral. And I was totally surprised because I said to myself, I wonder why she's asking me, because, I never knew her that well. But she told me later that he had talked to her about me. he was very, pleased with what I was doing with the newsletter, and I was just, I was just, at that time, I told you I was 24 years old. I met him, and he was assassinated 3 days before my 27th birthday.
Wow.
So and that's why he had talked positively about me to her. That's why she asked me to be a pallbearer at the funeral, which really totally surprised me. I had, it just really completely. I had no idea I was going to be a pallbearer.
Now that brings up.
And then after that, she and I became, and we spent a lot of time together after that, and meeting and talking and doing things and arguing. We get into a lot of arguing about different things, but we always made up. We might not speak to each other for a month, but then we get together again and hook up again. But so we had a pretty solid relationship after the assassination.
Now that a critical thing you brought up, the funeral and you being a pallbearer. I also heard that it was very difficult for his body to be taken care of by a funeral home, as well as people were in fear of having it, of course, at a mosque or at a church. So talk to us a little bit about those circumstances.
Well, let me tell you, brothers, the big churches in Harlem, the big churches all over, man, in Harlem and the surrounding area, they were just fearful of having his funeral there. Everybody was worried about, because there have been threats about that those elements in the Nation of Islam who had been critical of him and had been who many thought were a part of the assassination campaign, that they might try something at a funeral. It was rumored that they're going to come in and do this. So they were having a very difficult time. His body was in Unity, I think it was Unity Funeral Home, and there was thousands of people came for that, to see, to visit that Unity. But for the funeral services, it bugs me that there was a church, a Pentecostal church. Now you know how Pentecostal churches are. Pentecostal church up around 152nd Street and Broadway, and they agreed to let Brother Malcolm's funeral be there.
That's amazing.
And that was amazing, man. That this church and they deserve all the credit in the world. I'm so angry with myself now, because at 83 years old, man, some things I can't remember, and I can't remember the name of the church and the pastor, but I do know that it was on 152nd and 53rd Street and Broadway, and that's where the funeral was held, and of course that's where Ossie Davis gave his famous "The Black Shining Prince" eulogy. But that's where the funeral was held.
We're getting close
all the big churches in Harlem and the immediate area, man, they were fearful because they didn't know what was going to happen, and all that kind of stuff. So they would not let the funeral be held in their churches.
We're getting close to the end of our time, but I wanted to make sure that I covered a couple of things. Talk to us about your current book, and give us the title again and how people may be able to purchase that book.
Okay. One of the things I think that is too often ignored when talking about Brother Malcolm, and especially around his assassination, is, they try to limit it as another case of black on black homicide. And there's no doubt that there were elements, and I always say elements, in the Nation of Islam who were a part of the assassination. But everyone tries to completely ignore the role of the United States government. So my book, as I told you, Brother Malcolm, when he traveled in Africa, he was being treated almost like a royal, like not a royal, but like the foreign minister of Black people to Africa. And he also, his goal during the whole last year that was discussed from the first meeting we had all the way up was to take the United States government before the UN Commission on Human Rights. That's how we call our organization a human rights organization, not a civil rights organization, because human rights is the international term. There's a UN Commission on Human Rights, but you cannot, because the United States then, and I don't think to this day they haven't, they had never signed the UN Charter on Human Rights. They had not signed it. So in order to take them before the UN Commission on Human Rights, you had to get a member of the United Nations to do that. And Brother Malcolm was working, trying to get one of the African countries who would take our case before the UN Commission on Human Rights. He spent the whole last year of his life, that was much of his time doing. That's what I'm writing about in my book. It's called Brother Malcolm X's Visionary Strategic Pan-Africanism. And because he solely believed in that. And then the subtitle is Why It Enraged the United States Government. And everything is going to be like primary sources. I'm not having it retyped. I'm running the newspaper articles, Brother Malcolm's statements, everything just as is. And I just got a very recent column from a newspaper from a friend saying that when they had a celebration representing, honoring Jomo Kenyatta, who was the leader of the Mau Mau, who helped fight to get the independence for Kenya, they were celebrating him. And guess who was on stage? One of the people on stage he had invited. Brother Malcolm was on stage.
Wow.
Brother Malcolm was one of the guests. And this paper ran a very little article on it and put that at the very end. But they were very concerned. And let me give you a quote, brother, from J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover, in a book by this British writer, he quotes J. Edgar, about a 500-page book. There's only one mention of Brother Malcolm in that entire book, but it's extremely important. He said that J. Edgar Hoover had a meeting with Senator Lyndon Johnson. So if he had a meeting with Senator Lyndon Johnson, that means prior to 1960, because Johnson became vice president in 1960. At this meeting, Hoover said to Johnson, quote, "We wouldn't have any problem if we could get those two guys fighting, and we could get them to kill one another off." End of quote. Those two guys were Brother Malcolm and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
And later in,
back in the late 1950s, J. Edgar Hoover was already concerned about those two brothers and what they were doing, and especially what they were with their international reputations and how they were able to influence. And you know that the United States at that time was involved was involved in a major propaganda war with Russia. And of course, Russia was using the race things going on in this country against the United States on an international level. And they were very concerned about what Brother Malcolm, about his Pan-African policy and about taking the United States government for the UN Commission on Human Rights.
Any closing remarks? We're toward the end of our hour.
Okay, I just came across recently by a quote by Brother Malcolm. Again, the brother believed in gaining knowledge, the importance of knowledge, the right kind of knowledge, being educated, learning, listening. I came across a quote by him which goes like this, brother. "If your mind is armed, you are never unarmed." That's a powerful quote.
Sure is.
If your mind is armed, you are never unarmed. And Brother Malcolm believed in arming minds.
Wow.
Why I called him a master teacher.
Perfect segue to end our show and to think about and reflect upon Malcolm X. So thank you so much, Peter, for joining us. And I'd like to also thank all of our guests that tuned in today. Remind your friends that you can find us on Facebook on What's on Jerome's Mind. And also, I invite you to read the blogs and provide your comments. I invite you to share your tiny thoughts and large memories by contacting us and getting involved and posting your recollections. Also, join us next Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time as we share more voices of the 1960s. We'll be discussing the book by Anna Malika Tubbs, The title is The Three Mothers. The subtitle is How the Mothers of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and James Baldwin Shaped the Nation. And again, we will have Jerome's sister, Faye, serving as our host, who's done a really bang-up job, and I look forward to the conversation. Again, thank you for joining us, and have a great day. Thank you, Peter.